When it comes to fantasy, it's hard to imagine that there is any creature more ubiquitous or universal than the dragon. You know, we have Dungeons and Dragons, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Skyrim, World of Warcraft, Shrek. It seems wherever you look, if it's in the fantasy genre, there is a good chance that you'll find a fire-breathing dragon. And although it would be a bit of an overstatement to suggest that Tolkien invented dragons as we know them, I do believe that without him, dragons wouldn't be so familiar to the modern reader. I think it can be argued that Smaug the Golden is both the first great dragon of contemporary fantasy and the last great dragon of the old Germanic and Slavic and wider European mythologies. Smaug is the reason that, although you may struggle to picture like a manticore or a cockatrice, every single one of us knows what a dragon is. Ala Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, my name is Rainbow Dave and welcome to another Tolkien lore video. So today we are going to discuss the dragons of the Legendarium. But by starting with Smaug, I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. Because although he is the first dragon that Tolkien named in his published works, within the chronology of Aerendil, Smaug is the last of the great dragons. And there is a long heritage of monsters that preceded him. So in the annals of Aerendil, the very first dragon, the father of them all, is the great worm Galaurung. And Galaurung's date of birth, or I guess hatching, is unknown. His master Morgoth intentionally kept Galaurung's existence a secret until he was ready to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting elves. But as I guess is quite common with rebellious young beings, Galaurung was impatient, and he emerged from his master's dungeons 200 years before Morgoth was ready to unveil him. But Galaurung's official debut came with the disastrous Battle of Sudden Flame, which broke the military supremacy of the Noldor elves and their allies, and Galaurung was the reason for all this sudden flame. I mean, the Balrogs helped, but the father of the dragons led the largest army of orcs and evil things that the world had ever seen, and the elves and men withered before him. But the Battle of Sudden Flame was just a taste of the horror that Galaurung would eventually unleash. Only 17 years later came the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and this was arguably the greatest loss ever suffered by the Free Peoples in Middle-earth's history. In this battle, Galaurung once again emerged from Morgoth's fortress, but this time he was not the only one of his kind. Tolkien tells us about Galaurung's brood, which he describes as many and terrible. And these children of Galaurung's cause immense devastation upon the field of battle. Now, within Middle-earth, not all dragons are created equal. And, as is always the case with Tolkien, there are a few different types of dragons throughout the Legendarium. But Galaurung and his brood are among some of the most dangerous, for they are all of the class of Uruloki, known more commonly as the Fire Drakes. And as the name suggests, Galaurung and his brood were all endowed with the ability to breathe dragonfire. And dragonfire is no ordinary thing. In The Lord of the Rings, we're told that it's hot enough to melt rings of power. The only other place where that could happen is, of course, in the fires of Mount Doom. But anyway, in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, Galaurung and his children lay waste to the lands of the sons of Feanor, and they sweep apart the two factions of elven allies. And when that is done, Galaurung went after Lord Azaghal, who is the chief of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. And although Azagal's dwarven army hewed Galaurung and they sent him into a rage, they were unable to kill him. And when the battle was over, Azagal was just another slain hero who'd met his end in the fires of Galaurung. And there's something really interesting here, because although in the First Age dragons are portrayed as the destroyers of many mighty elven armies, and in later ages they're known as like the great enemies of the dwarves, in Tolkien's entire legendarium, we aren't told of a single named dragon who is ever killed by either an elf or a dwarf. Every dragon that dies is slain by a single mortal man, standing alone in single combat. And this brings us to the eventual doom of Galaurung. Now, I don't want to unnecessarily spoil anything, I'll cover this in much greater detail in future Silmarillion videos, but just like with all future dragons, Galaurung is eventually slain by a mortal man. And there's no battle, there are no armies, there is simply Galaurung and the son of Húrin. But before the hero's black sword pierces Galaurung's belly, Tolkien demonstrates some of the other lesser-known powers that Galaurung the Great Worm possesses. Because, although the dragon I guess is most famous for his fiery and poisonous breath, he does have another power that proves perhaps even more destructive. You see, Galaurung is a master of minds. Not unlike Sauron, he uses deception against his enemies. But that is not the limit of what he can do. More than once in the Legendarium, Galaurung uses his power to hypnotize his enemies, and he freezes them in place, which renders them completely helpless against him. But even this is not his greatest gift. At one point in the story, Galaurung comes across a young maiden, and he uses some sort of spell to utterly obliterate her mind. He destroys her memories. And when he's finished with her, the maiden is left with no idea who she is, or why she's there, or even what her name is. And, well, just like most of the tales in the Children of Húrin, the story ends really badly for said maiden. But eventually Galaurung is slain, and so he becomes the first in a long line of dragons to be killed by mannish heroes. Over the ages he will be joined by the long worm Scatha, who was slain by Fram, an ancestor of the men of Rohan. Then there is the Beast of Gondolin, who is vanquished by Tuor, who happens to be the only man in a city full of elves. And of course, lastly, Smaug the Golden is not slain by dwarves, or by wizards, or by hobbits, but by Bard the Bowman and his black arrow. However, of all the dragons in Tolkien's Legendarium, there is one who stands out amongst all others. One dragon who is undoubtedly the greatest of his kind, the mightiest of them all, and the ancestor of all future winged dragons. His name is Ankalagon the Black. Now, the truth is that we don't know a huge amount about Ankalagon, but we do know that Morgoth bred him to be the greatest dragon that ever lived. And he was unleashed in Morgoth's final hour. Now, there is a little bit of debate amongst fans in regards to Ankalagon's size. You see, if you Google him, you'll probably find an image comparing the sizes of all the dragons in Middle-earth, and Ankalagon will no doubt be outrageously huge. And to be fair, Ankalagon was massive, but he probably wasn't that massive. I mean, we know he could fly, and even in a fantasy setting, like, the laws of physics do have a limit. Although, again, to be fair, we are told that when Ankalagon was cast down, his body fell from the sky and it broke all three of the tallest mountains in Middle-earth when he landed on top of them. So he is huge, don't get me wrong, but I would argue that this breaking of the mountains is more due to his power than his size. After all, we're also told that when Gandalf killed the Balrog in The Lord of the Rings and he cast its body off the peak of Ziraxigil, it also broke the mountainside. But that doesn't mean that the Balrog is like the size of a mountain. Anyway, regardless of the question of his size, Ankalagon's might is undeniable. For a moment, it looked like he might be powerful enough to drive back the combined strength of the Valar. And Tolkien tells us that Ankalagon led the vanguard of the winged dragons that had never before been seen. And so sudden and ruinous was the onset of that dreadful fleet that the host of the Valar was driven back. For the coming of the dragons was with great thunder and lightning and a tempest of fire. But as with all others, even Ankalagon was eventually slain. And just like all others, his doom came at the hand of a single individual, Aerendil the Mariner. Now, referring to Aerendil as like a mortal man is a little bit misleading, because technically he is the son of a mortal man and an immortal elf. In fact, he is the only pure 50-50 man-elf hybrid in the whole Legendarium. Well, except for Galador and Gilimith, who I mentioned in that video about the half-elves of Gondor. But for most of his life, Aerendil is counted amongst the race of men. And just like Fram and Tuor and Bard and the son of Húrin, he alone takes down Ankalagon in what must have been one of the most epic battles in Middle-earth's history. So, with Ankalagon dead, the race of dragons seemed to disappear from the world for a very long time. Throughout the entire Second Age, the longest of the ages, there is absolutely no reference to any living dragon of any kind. But they were not all gone. And in the Third Age, dragons returned to once again plague the free peoples of the North. But many of these dragons were a little bit different. So, we're told by Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings that the 7 dwarven rings were the foundations of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old. And it's highly likely that these treasure hoards were what attracted the dragons of the Grey Mountains in the first place. Gandalf tells us that the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire. And in the year 2570 of the Third Age, dragons returned from the wastes beyond, and thus began the Great War of the Dwarves and the Dragons. However, as I said, not all these dragons were like the Uruloki of the First Age. Many of these dragons were cold drakes, known as Foaloki. And Tolkien tells us that they are cold as in the nature of snakes and serpents. And of them are many having wings that go with the uttermost noise and speed. So, these dragons can fly, but they can't breathe fire. However, the War of the Dwarves and Dragons is not a happy story, I'm afraid. For 20 years, the dwarves fought the dragons, and in that time, they held their ground in the Grey Mountains. But ultimately, this was not a war the dwarves could win. Eventually, King Dain I and his son Thror were killed by a cold drake outside their very own doors. And this marked the end of the dwarves' resistance in the Grey Mountains. King Dain's eldest son, and now his heir, Thror, which is that same Thror who eventually becomes the grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield, led many of the dwarven survivors to Erebor, where they rebuilt the great dwarven kingdom under the mountain. And for 200 years, the dwarves of Erebor prospered under their new king Thror. However, the dragons that killed Thror's father were not gone, And in the year 2770 of the Third Age, Thror would face a terror far greater than the one that killed his father and brother. Because, of course, 2770 is the year that Smaug the Golden descended from the north like a hurricane, and he sacked Erebor. He killed every guard who came out to challenge him, he destroyed the city of Dale, and for the following 171 years, Smaug slept on his newly acquired pile of gold. Now, I reckon we all know the story of Smaug's eventual demise, and I'm not going to explain the entire plot of The Hobbit, but when Bard the Bowman fired that fateful arrow, not only did he kill Smaug and rescue Laketown and avenge Dale, but he also ended a far greater conflict. He killed the last great dragon of the North. And he finally ended the threat that Morgoth had unleashed with Galaurung at the Battle of Sudden Flame 6,517 years earlier. But there is one last thing to say about Smaug. Because although he is the last great dragon of the Legendarium, one could argue that he is also the last great dragon of a far older literary tradition. You see, although I think it's fair to say that Tolkien popularized dragons in the genre of modern fantasy, he made them famous, he did not, of course, invent them. Dragons have been staples of Slavic and Iberian and Brittonic folklore, and perhaps the most famous tales of dragons and mortal men, at least in Western European traditions, comes from the writings of Tolkien's beloved ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons. So, between 1920 and 1926, Tolkien jumped headfirst into the realm of Old English literature by translating the epic tale of Beowulf into modern English. And of course, at the end of the tale, the hero Beowulf, and spoiler for a poem that's literally over 1,000 years old, dies slaying a giant fire-breathing dragon. Furthermore, in the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which Tolkien translated in 1920, whilst working as his university's youngest professor, by the way, Sir Gawain battles fire-breathing worms. And of course, perhaps the most famous of all the Anglo-Saxon tales to feature fire-breathing dragons is the Norse-Germanic Volsunga saga, starring the fire-breathing monster Fafnir and the mortal man Sigurd. And this is the same Sigurd, or Siegfried, that Christoph Waltz talks about in Django Unchained, and he's one of the main characters in Wagner's The Ring Cycle. Now, there are a number of striking similarities between Fafnir and Smaug, as well as between Fafnir and Glaurung. In fact, Bilbo's dialogue with Smaug almost perfectly mirrors Sigurd's exchange with Fafnir, and Glaurung's description as a flightless dragon who hoarded gold and breathes poison also mirrors Fafnir perfectly. So, I guess this means that although dragons have been a part of Western imagination for over 1,000 years, and although dragons have become one of the most recognisable elements of modern fantasy, it is Tolkien who tied these two strands together, and he popularised dragons as we know them today. So, not too long ago, I was with my nephew, and we were watching a movie, and he wanted to put on How to Train Your Dragon. And so I watched it, and to be honest, I enjoyed it. But I was immediately struck by the fact that the humans, despite speaking with Scottish accents, all claim that they are Vikings. Why is it that even in a 21st century children's movie, we associate dragons with Old Norse mythology? It's because of Tolkien. It's because Tolkien created the first dragons of the modern era by adapting the ancient dragons of Europe's historic past. Think about that the next time you see a dragon on TV. Anyway, Thank you all very much for watching. That's it for this video. But if you enjoyed it, there are plenty more just like it on the channel, so check them out. And as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Navaya Melanine.